It's been interesting to see the, at least as far as I've noted, mostly positive response actually to this vehicle being brought in to Gran Turismo 7. It is of course the 2020 shape, updated AMG GT3 Evo. Some slightly different specs, which of course we'll talk about in a second, and what could easily initially seem like just another needless duplicate, as the saying goes. Of course it's not a duplicate, it is an updated car, and even though you can make an argument both sides of the fence, my side being more so that I wish it were a new brand or a completely new model rather than an update, but on the other hand, you can certainly make an argument, especially with how important stuff like GT3 racing is to the more FIA-leaning side of Gran Turismo's lineage, the esports stuff. Well then, of course it makes sense to have newer shaped machines to keep up with the times a bit more. So, like I said, you can certainly support both sides of that, and it is cool to see how many people, generally at least, seem quite happy about this car being in the game. And of course I put some of my thoughts out there regarding in particular this and the Super Formulas having slightly more slippery handling than I was expecting them to have, and partially due to, I believed, maybe an update in physics that we've had more recently to the tyres, the curbs, stuff like that. Now I believe that did have a factor, but now that I've gotten a bit more used to these cars again, I don't feel like it's as steep as I initially thought. In fact, getting into this one, it was fine to work with. And ultimately, although the specs are different, and although technically it is an updated car, they're not radically different. And of course, when balance of performance is applied, anything can change depending on what the arbitrary rules of the particular event are, but at least straight out of the box, what you're looking at for 480,000 credits, so a slight hike in price, but not by too much, is a vehicle with a base point level of 736, so pretty much what you'd expect, 614 horsepower, 1285 kilos, which is a notable difference because that is lower than the existing AMG GT3 in the game. Of course it's still front engine, rear wheel drive, and naturally aspirated. It is, again, as I spoke about in my first thoughts on 1.32 in that standalone video, both longer and taller than the outgoing car. Not notably so. If you flick between them in the dealership, you can kind of see the height difference. The length difference, not so much. The aero, of course, making a big difference to that length in terms of just the numbers alone. What about in terms of how it performs? Well, to me, the AMG GT3, both in the existing form and this updated form, is one of those cars that I would describe as like a safe choice. It's not the kind of car which I personally usually go for, but I'm also probably not the best of people to ask for a recommendation. Because what you really should do, if you want to win events, is generally speaking look at what most people use. Because if there's one thing you can bet on the community finding, it's very quickly working out what the best cars to use for any given event is. So generally speaking, the consensus is usually correct. So whatever car most people recommend and most people tend to use is probably the one to go for. I've always more so been the kind of person to go for something like a Panos, because it's nowhere near as good, but I just like it. And I would rather, honestly, I would rather lose representing a team that I love than win in a car that I couldn't care less about. Which is one of the many reasons why I would be a horrendous race driver. I guess a team would probably love me if I were better at it, but that's not the mentality that you're supposed to have, being victory is the main goal. In terms of choosing one of these though, I would describe it as one of those safe choices. Much like your Nissan GTRs and various others, they are popular for a reason. The AMG GT is a car which I initially didn't like in real life because I thought it was a very understated, very safe looking car, especially compared to the outgoing SLS, even more so compared to what came before that as Mercedes' flagship car, the SLR. Then though, you take one out on the road, as I did, in Beards and Cars, you take one out in the game, in road form, in race form, and everything in between, and you realise very quickly that, okay, it might not look as special, but it certainly is. Black Edition cars, although, well, controversial, let's say in this game, but especially the GTR version when it comes to road cars, is again a very good choice. So it's logical that the race car would be even better, and Mercedes of course has, let's just say, plenty of experience when it comes to racing, so it's not surprising that it would be good. To me, I've always found these AMGs to be a little bit on the heavier side when it comes to steering, which is again one of the reasons why that very low speed slip-slidey nature that it has a bit of snap oversteer, if you will, sometimes, kind of surprised me. It's not usually the kind of car that falls into that rut of handling. I think of it more so like the Nissan, where it's a little heavier and you have to compensate for that instead. So for those who maybe found it too heavy, maybe you'll find this one to be more nimble than it was before. Perhaps you'd have to, of course, assess that on a personal case-by-case basis, but for me, I think it's an update which I wouldn't say is the most radical thing around on paper. In practice, you're probably going to see this thing being used more so, especially as time goes on, more and more in live events, for example, wouldn't surprise me at all, and it could well be a marker, a harbinger, if you will, now that we have the updated Nissan, the updated version of this. I would say there's probably a pretty good chance we're going to see some updated versions of others too. The Audi was technically already updated as well, so I think that trend could well continue with some other vehicles also. That, although it doesn't directly pertain to this review technically, actually kind of excites me more than any of these individual cars so far, because what that could mean is either something like an updated, say, Viper or updated Corvette, or maybe more excitingly, something like a C8 Corvette in Group 3 form to replace the outgoing C7. If you are going to extensively update the ranks of Group 3, stuff like that isn't outside of the realm of possibility. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it very well could happen, and to more teams than just that. So to me, I like cars like this because of what they represent for the future. In terms of this one, it's not a car that I use a ton anyway, even in non-updated form, so this one to me is not a car that I'll be using all that much, but I would love to hear your thoughts as well. But in terms of this one, it's a car which doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it's definitely a positive step in the evolution of the car. The lower weight could well be negated by balance of performance anyway, so take that with a pinch of salt. Ultimately though, give me your thoughts down below. Do you love the car? Do you maybe like the existing one more? Do you find this one better, maybe unequivocally? Or even if you have some tuning that you think people need to know about it, of course, you could drop any of that in the comments. But of course, stick around tomorrow for my dual review of both of the Dalaras in one video for obvious reasons. And if you haven't already checked it out, I of course discussed the Jaguar XJ220 from this same update yesterday on the channel. But that's it for this vid. Of course, I'll see you next time. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.